Well, good afternoon, everybody. I have to say, from my professor days, I always hated the 1 o'clock slot. Nobody wants to teach after lunch. But we've got such a great panel today that I know that you'll find this stimulating and engaging. And I am so pleased to be here on behalf of the National Academy of Public Administration. Chairman Volcker became a fellow of the Academy in 1987. And so this year, as the Academy celebrates its 50th birthday, I'm incredibly honored to be here to celebrate his 90th. And so we'll get started with our panel. This morning we heard a lot about the disruptors of government, the proper functions of government, and the frustrations with government. Gridlock in Washington kind of being at the top of that list. So our panel today is going to try to answer the question, how can government, with all of these things that are going on, actually deliver services that our citizens expect? So I thought we'd start with a level-setting question, which is around the divides in the country. The Academy's just finished a 4-part symposium out across the country that we called Governing Across the Divide. And our last presidential election certainly revealed many of these, whether it's geographic or income or education or even the digital divide. So is what we're experiencing today something that's really new and different, or is it just a different flavor of things that have gone on over time with our country? And Congressman Davis, I thought we'd start with you.
Well, I think it's different. Look, one of the major factors, I think, in the divide right now is this: the way people receive their news and their information. What we call the crap to content ratio coming over this is just exceptionally high, and you have people and groups and basically tribes living in their own realities. We see it on cable television, we see it in talk radio, we've seen it ever since the Federal Communications Commission did away with the Fairness Doctrine. But that is, I think, one of the major problems, is everybody's got their own set of facts at this point, their own reality of what works, what doesn't work, and you have people that basically their business model is to stir the pot. And I think that's made it much more difficult on the governance structure and in people perceiving what's really going on, whether it affects them or not. Just two other quick factors is you've got the alignment now in politics of these single party districts, so that the center has collapsed and most members, the only race that counts is their primary election. General elections are just basically constitutional formalities they go through, so they cater their time, their attention, and their voting records to primary voters, which are a pretty thin ideological slice of the electoral pie. And third, you heard Bill Bradley talk about this at lunch. I mean, the money is moved from the center, which was political parties, out to these super PACs on the right and the left, which were enforcement mechanisms for these other models. And it's led to a very polarized country and very polarized views of what's happening.
So thank you. Secretary Fox?
I don't really have anything to add. I think that was a pretty good summation. The only other point I would make, which is just maybe putting a little more color on it, is that within the context that Congressman Davis just outlined, there's still people on both sides who want to get things done. And they will actually tell you, gosh, I really want to do this, but I can't, because if I do, I'm going to get hammered. And so there's this classic issue between political survival and getting things done. And I think you're starting to see people stepping out of Congress now, partly because it's gotten to be untenable.
Mayor Miner?
Yeah, I can tell you that for me, what has been remarkable about it is the rapidity of the change. So when I was first elected mayor 8 years ago, the office that I walked into in the city communicated by fax. And then these young whippersnappers that I hired started talking about Facebook. And I said to them, Facebook, only you young people communicate on Facebook. Now, 8 years later, even the 80-year-olds in Syracuse are communicating on Facebook. And so it's the rapidity of the change on top of the disruptors. At a local government level, you know, when I started 8 years ago, there was a daily newspaper, and that would be the communication vehicle. That's how you got your facts out. That's how you talked about policy. That's how you talked about ideas. That doesn't exist anymore. There's a website, and so it's hard to get a sense of what are the facts that people are acknowledging, what do they understand, and how do you communicate and establish a process where you have accountability and trust on both sides.
Good point. Dr. Roden?
The historian Tom Bender talks a lot about the thinning of public discourse. So there was a lot of rancor in the earliest days of our great republic, and they yelled at each other, and a lack of civility that we don't recall anymore, but existed right in our founding. But public discourse was thick. They listened to each other. They fought over ideas. They were philosophically sort of fighting, and now we have witnessed, partly through technology, but not all through technology, such a thinning of public discourse that we don't listen to each other, we don't hear across the divide, we're not made to hear across the divide, and we speak in ever more simple sentences and ideas, and we pander. Mm-hmm. And that thinning of public discourse is a very high risk to our democracy.
So I think something I've heard all of you touch on here is this issue of trust in government and how it is reinforced or aggravated through the tools and the communications of the time. I mean, recent surveys tell us that 72% of Americans say they trust their local government to do the right thing all or most of the time, and yet only 22% trust the federal government to do the right thing all or most of the time. So I want to start with our two mayors. How does that impact how we think about government and government service delivery?
Well, from my perspective, having now done federal service and local service, I can say that I wish we could give local government more tools. Just in the transportation context, let's say, most of the money that USDOT puts out it's like $72 billion a year, and about $45 billion of it goes to the states. The states then allocate it kind of in these regions across the states, but it sort of is under the rules of the state and not necessarily the local needs of a region like Syracuse or other places. I think we've hampered local government and made it very difficult for local government to do what I think local government can do in this time, which is to show us a way to pull the urban core, the suburban areas, and the rural areas around those cores together so that our politics begins to speak a little bit more coherently across all these lines, which are so difficult for us to untangle at the federal level.
I agree with Anthony, not surprising, mayors agree with mayors. I would tell you that it's, people trust their local governments because they can put eyes on you, they can hold you accountable. And you can't run away from a problem because you're going to go to the grocery store, you're going to go to church, you're going to go to the school, you're going to be out in your neighborhood. And Congress people legislators have the luxury of kind of stepping in and out of issues, or if something's really hot, all they have to do is give a 30-second soundbite. Local government officials don't. And also, as a consequence, I would tell you that people who run for local government office are problem solvers. Like, that's what intrigues us. And local government, in comparison to state and federal government, is very facile. And, we can try to solve problems, and we can react instantaneously. We can measure it by data. We can change it. And as a consequence, I think that our constituents see us really trying. The problem becomes, from my perspective, is that the system, as the federal government has walked away from urban policy and state governments have walked away from urban policy, we in local government have become very good at ad hoc solutions. But then what happens is nobody's holding the federal and state government accountable for the fact that they walked away from these responsibilities. And let me just illustrate this point. The FEMA came into Syracuse and did a new flood map and said in one of the poorest census tracts in the United States said that these people were going to have flood insurance. And there's major disinvestment in this census tract already, huge issues. And the local folks came and protested me. And I went out and I met with them and I said, this is great, that you guys are exercising your right, but the F in FEMA stands for federal. It's not me that's doing this. And yet their frustration was, and they said to me, but Mayor, you're the only one who will talk to us. You're the only one who will sit down with us and explain it to us. And I think part of that reason is because the state and the federal government, people don't feel like they have tools or resources anymore to address those problems. So it's easier to not have a conversation if you don't have an answer.
And Congressman Davis, you were at the county and the congressional level.
15 years in county government, too. One of the things we've got to realize is most of what the federal government does now is they're taken from one group and given to another. They're just redistributing money, and the core of government in terms of building infrastructure and those kind of things, they're not funding that the same way. Those things are being cut back, and they're passing mandates and the bill back to you. But you're accountable for results. In Congress, the default vote now is just a no vote and then blame it on somebody else. And they've kind of walked away from it. And I think as an institution, I see Norm Ornstein, the broken branch, it really has. They just walked away from a lot of problems and kicked them down the road.
And I would just add to the comments both mayors made that we find in our funding that mayors are willing to innovate. They're willing to take more risks. They're willing to try lots of new things in a way that we have not found at the federal governmental level, even though there are offices of innovation or whatever, but there's some tiny little unit stuck in some other tiny little unit. And it is because they need to deliver all the time and because they are so visible and available, and therefore they feel more accountable to their constituents on quite a regular basis. And they love talking about the innovations that they're supporting, and the general public gets that, and they appreciate it.
So in addition...
Can I pick up on that? I mean, that's a very important part, because your innovation is going on at your state and federal level. It's just not going on in Washington for any number of reasons. We get so regulation-driven in Washington now, the mission often is just not to make a mistake. And, you know, if you're not making mistakes, you're not innovating. But every incentive in Washington is to stay within the four corners, stay within the regulations, where you can't afford that because you're held accountable for results.
Correct. Big difference, yep.
If I could jump in here too, I had one success in helping local governments innovate, which was the Smart City Challenge we did, which was an effort by the U.S. Department of Transportation to actually push innovation out into the cities and to say, okay, we're going to put money in place, $40 million of federal money. If you can come up with a creative way to address mobility and sustainability and all kinds of things. And we got 70 cities to apply for this, and it gave cities an opportunity to think outside of the box. And I think it was one of the best examples of how the federal government actually can find ways to create an environment where innovation occurs in local government.
So we've heard a lot about trust, and we've heard a lot about the importance of being innovative at the local level. I want to take this one more step farther. Demographic trends tell us that our workforce is going to shrink over the future. Our tax base is going to shrink over the future. But the demands for government services are going to increase. So in a world where the federal government exercises less presence, but the demands for federal services are growing, or government services are growing, how do we bridge that gap? What are the tools, the resources, the innovative governance solutions that we can bring to really get government to deliver the services and the solutions that its citizens expect? And so here, Dr. Roden, I want to start with you.
People think about philanthropy as just direct grant making. And we will never have enough money in philanthropy to fill in the gaps, the funding gaps for the federal government. Our role is to take more risk, to innovate, to work across sectors. So direct grant making is really not the answer. What we've been working on with many of our colleagues is really how to think more creatively about new forms of public-private partnerships, which can give the federal government dollars more leverage. So I'll just give a couple of examples. After Sandy hit New York and the recovery was underway, Sean Donovan, who was running the federal task force, had $2 billion, which was going to go into the recovery, both through transportation and also HUD and the Small Business Association. And he had this idea, we had been working on resilience and making cities more resilient, that we would run a global competition called Resilience by Design that would take $1 billion and have communities involved with experts in helping to think about the rebuild, and create an effort that said the federal government ought to get more than one bang for the buck. So if it's investing in a seawall or a flood wall around Lower Manhattan, and we engage the communities, we can also get new bike paths and new market spaces and the like. Sean called me and said, I have the $1 billion, but I don't have the $4.5 million that it would actually take to run the competition. I can't authorize that through federal government dollars. Would you pay for the competition, and then we'll leverage the $1 billion? That was so successful that we then ran a national Rebuild by Design with another $1 billion, where the 74 affected communities that had been called national disasters within the prior 3 years were able to apply. And again, that one cost us about $7 million, and another $1 billion of federal capital was released. So there's lots of ways. We see at the local level, Kresge and Ford and Knight intervening. They are taking the central role in rebuilding Detroit with philanthropic ideas and philanthropic capital, leveraging the federal and state level capital that's going to come in there. There's also, if I can just give one more example, creative ways that philanthropy can use its money. So we have an initiative called 100 Resilient Cities, where we had 1,100 cities actually from around the world apply, and we chose 100. And each city gets a chief resilience officer that Rockefeller pays for. And that person is required to report to the mayor directly, but sit outside city government so that it can really produce collaboration across civil society and the private sector and all of the other actors, and frankly, candidly, to the mayors, help break down the silos within municipal government, which sometimes create equal stasis and lack of transparency. So we created a platform of private sector companies that will now give goods and services to those cities, negotiated through the chief resilience officer. So again, a couple $100 million for Rockefeller, but it's unleashed about $3 billion in goods and services that the federal government can now build on with its capital. So the idea of tiering capital is something that is really important, where the philanthropy will take the first level of risk, the private sector will take the second level through its investment, and a government actually only needs to take the third level of risk. But you release a lot of capital. Mm-hmm. There isn't enough money in government or in philanthropy to solve all of our social problems. So unless we think creatively about how to engage private capital, Frank talked about it this morning in terms of Canada's model in infrastructure, we don't have a capital budget in our federal government, which is one of the other reasons that they find it so difficult to invest. So there are many policy changes that we could produce that would release more private capital into the needs of our citizens, including social and economic needs, not just infrastructure.
That's a great point. Mayor Miner, I know you've done a lot of work in infrastructure in Syracuse with leverage. So tell us a little bit about that.
We have. I mean, our philanthropy partners have been fantastic, and it's allowed us to leverage. So it started off with a Bloomberg Philanthropies Innovation Grant, and then we hired very smart young people who were data experts. And, you know, cities are repositories of just all sorts of data. And now in an age of big data where everybody's trying to think about how can we use this, that is a partnership that institutions want. They want access to our data. And so whether it's with Syracuse University or Bloomberg Philanthropies, part of what we say is you can have access to our data, and in turn, can you show us how we can use it to become more efficient and more effective? And also using our philanthropy partners to be third-party independent validators. As the media has been disrupted, to be a change agent or to implement policy, you need to be able to stand up to your constituents and say, this isn't just a crazy idea that I as the mayor had. This is a crazy idea that I as the mayor had, and here's Syracuse University and the Rockefeller Institute and Bloomberg Philanthropy saying, yes, we believe in it too, so much that we're going to invest in it. So using those third-party independent, you know, people are placing capital is a way where your constituents will say, well, you know, they're smart people, and if they're going to give their money up, then maybe we should be a part of it. But there has been a revolution in technology and data, obviously, that has surpassed most all the municipal governments. I think perhaps one of the benefits that we in municipal governments have is now that we can turn to them and say, hey, help us catch up, so that we can use those tools to be more accountable, to be better communicators, and to be, again, more efficient and effective.
And Secretary Fox, at DOT, you had some challenging issues to overcome.
Yes, we did. On this point of how government becomes leaner and more effective, I do think technology is a big piece of the conversation. But one has to realize that in agencies, the energy is usually around perpetuating systems as opposed to changing systems. And I had a situation, in fact, where we had agencies within the U.S. Department of Transportation who had the same functional use for certain technologies, but they were using different platforms. And we said, well, can we just consolidate these platforms? And the answer back was, well, it's going to take us 5 years, and it's going to cost X. Even though you could clearly see the efficiencies at the end of the day, they're making that system integration work because I stomped on them. But the point is that it shouldn't take all of that. And I think that's a problem. I think Congressman Davis pointed it out. I think government's just got to, we've got to realize that we need government to reinvent itself, I think, as Senator Bradley said earlier. But it's going to take risk among agency leaders to do that, and it's going to take money to do that. We're going to have to spend money to get those efficiencies.
Let me just add, if you think partisan fights are bad, try these turf fights, either within an agency or jurisdictional fights in Congress, and that really digs in, and you get too many stovepipes up there, not enough interconnectivity as it goes through. But the other problem is, what's government's role, as we talk about, what's the philanthropic, how do you move this together? So when I left Congress, I took charge of building the rail system out to Dulles, and DOT was very helpful with the TIFIA loans, but they have a good criteria. They made sure that we were meeting our markers along the way to make this happen. At the end of the day, the toll users ended up paying, which probably is fairer than the taxpayers at large when you go through this stuff. But every problem is different. There's not one template that fits everything, has been my experience.
So following up on that, then, how do we get folks in Congress to be a little bit more creative in the solutions that they're willing to accept? That was your question.
Well, yeah. Look, I think I was chief sponsor of over 100 pieces of legislation, and none of them were my bill. I mean, somebody came to me with a good idea. And I happened to be a committee chairman, and in the House, things move pretty quick, and you could get them going and then attach it to something. So it really comes from you talking to somebody and making sense and talking through it. The difficulty, in Congress now is if it's not bipartisan, it's very hard to get through. Mm-hmm. It's just partisan gridlock through. The House has passed a ton of bills that are sitting in the Senate, but we make it hard to pass laws. That's by our very design. It was designed that way. It's gotten even harder at this point. And innovative laws that upset some group or arouse some level of controversy, you can go to hearings to death. It's just very difficult. The inertia factor is in Congress like it is everywhere else. Members get risk averse, get tired of beaten down because the people that benefit from the innovation usually aren't as loud as the people who feel disadvantaged.
Just one other point on this. One also has to understand the role of elections in all of this. So if you're going to do, for example, a 5-year integration of a computer system, or if Congress is going to suggest creating a whole range of smart city challenges, let's say, those things take time. Once a bill passes, then usually a regulation has to be written towards it. Then an agency has to begin starting to implement whatever the policy is. And the fruits of it don't really bear fruit for maybe it crosses another term or 2 terms. So there's also a slowness with which government moves to actually produce the result that someone was looking for in the first place. And I think that's also part of the problem as well.
Let me say to Anthony's point.
More bluntly?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I always chuckle, though, because around election time, every federal politician wants to be so close to me like we're Velcro. And the ones that I can have this conversation with, they'll say, there's a reason that we have popularity, because people think we are effective and we get things done, and you want that to rub off on you around election time. You should be around here more than just election time doing things. Now, when I first became mayor 8 years ago, within like 8 days of being mayor, it was whispered to me, Tiger grants, Tiger grants. I mean, Tiger grants are like, it's like nirvana, because there's not a lot of control, there's not a lot in comparison. It's a lot more freedom with that money. And what we were fortunate enough to get a Tiger grant. We did some great things with infrastructure in the city of Syracuse. And what I was able to use that for with our federal representatives is to say, see what we've done, see what a big change it's made. We stand ready, willing, and able, once you get these resources, to do tremendous work with innovative infrastructure that you guys are thinking back in the 1960s, and it's not like that anymore. There are sensors, there's data, there's all these things that can make the dollar stretch further. Here's the portfolio. The problem is I'm not sure that the federal government wants to do that anymore. I just don't have a sense that solving those problems or addressing those issues is part of what they believe that their core mission is. And so fundamentally, if they don't want to govern, or if they see governing as cutting taxes only, well, issues that help build our economies, fall to local governments to, again, work and try to do it on an ad hoc basis and, do it in a much more smaller scale.
I would just add to that, and I agree with the other comments completely, that there's too much intermediation between the citizens and what they need and the elected officials in Congress. So we've created a system where they hear much more from advocacy groups or lobbyists or the like than they do from their own constituents, who aren't able to leverage their own capacity in an organized enough way. So if the congressperson isn't reaching out and the constituent isn't able to get to them, this whole permafrost intermediate layer is really what's lobbying in ideas and thinking. That has a very chilling effect on how effective they can be and how the individual citizen experiences their relationship to Congress. When I was in Philadelphia, we would always hear the joke, I hate Congress, but I love my individual congressperson. We don't hear that anymore, almost anywhere we work. So people are experiencing Congress, I think, at a fundamentally different level and with a lot of displeasure.
Mm-hmm. So that actually kind of gets me to my next question, which is we've talked a lot about what the government responsibility is to try to drive solutions, but I want to ask a question from the other side, and what are our citizens' responsibilities? We have one of the lowest voting levels of any developed country. We saw it over and over, and I think the number I have here is like less than 60% of eligible voters voted in the 2016 presidential election. So how do we get citizens to engage in this process? Is there an education? Is there a messaging? How do we get the connection back that you just mentioned?
Don Kettle talked about the pleasure that he gets with his young people in class because they seem to be so eager to be engaged. So really reinforcing community engagement in students and members of our community. If you look at the data after a disaster of any kind, it's your neighbor who's the first responder. It actually isn't the fireman or the police person. And in most cities, for most emergencies, that comes later and next. So building back civic engagement is a first step to building back the ability to see one's vote as mattering, to really feel that one's voice can make a difference. And we haven't invested enough in those community-based institutions or in as systematic a way, because they are the first line that the citizen really experiences.
So I was campaign chairman 2 cycles. I will tell you, V.O. Key, the great political scientist, said voters aren't stupid. He said, but they're just not that informed, but they know when the shoe is pinching. Yeah. And we saw last year a group of people been ignored by and large by the major parties, felt the shoe was pinching and came out. And then in Virginia, a different group felt a different pinch this year. But the average voter, I think, doesn't think that whoever they vote for is going to make a difference in their lives. They just don't see a big difference on this, which is why you get into a lot of these attack ads and fear-mongering and everything else to try to motivate people to come out rather than the like. I don't think we do a great job of government education at the lower levels. I teach political science in college, and sometimes my foreign students are better than the students that have gone through American high schools in terms of their basic knowledge of what's going on and interest in what's going on. So I don't think we do enough civic engagement even at that level, giving people the basics. But you've got to make government relative to people's lives, and we don't do a very good job communicating how much that is. The irony is local government is more highly regarded than the federal government, but the turnout for federal elections much higher than you get for local elections. Yet you probably have more practical effect on people's lives.
Well, I have a subjective response to that and an objective. So let me start with the objective and talk from a New York State perspective. It is hard to vote. In New York State, we don't, you have to register almost 18 months in a party. We don't have same-day registration. You have to have an excuse to vote by absentee. Your registration is tied to your residence. Now, if you are young or if you are poor, you tend to be transient, which means you can't vote because you're moving all the time and you're not tied to that. I think it's become much more sinister in that the lower voter turnout is helping the people who are in power. And such, they are, we talk about it in terms of gerrymandering, people picking their own voters. I think it even goes down a deeper level that, the less people that participate, the more that I just have to get certain key interest groups fed, and then I will continue to keep getting reelected, and the system will work for everybody except for the masses. I have friends of mine who are in elected office in Oregon, and they talk about, they've had elections in Oregon where they have vote by mail, where they've reached 80%. With the systems that we now have with data and technology, notwithstanding the kind of civic discussion we're going on now about what happened in 2016, we should make it easier to vote. And I will tell you that as a local government official, lots of people care very deeply about their neighborhood, about government policies, about their neighbors. And we have done, I think by design in some cases, a really remarkable job of telling them that their vote doesn't matter, they shouldn't worry about this. So the good news from that is I think there is energy there. Young people are very enthused about making the world a better place, and there are people who care deeply about their neighbors. And now I think we have to systemically make it easier and revitalize our democracy.
Well, in New York, you had 3 primaries last year.
Yeah, it's crazy. I'm not going to defend it.
When I ran for mayor of Charlotte in 2009, my communications team sat me down and they said, "Look, we've got to tell you something." I said, "What is it?" They said, "You're black." I said, "I knew that." Then they said, in a city that's 35% African American, largely white, when you walk in the room, people are going to think, number one, you're going to raise their taxes, and number two, you're going to be soft on crime. So you have to figure out how to navigate that through your context. I make this point because I think one of the most important things citizens need to do now is we have enough divisions in this country between urban, rural, black, white, immigration status, or what have you. Government's not going to fix that. We're going to have to fix it in our own lives in different ways. It's where we live, where we go to school, who our kids interact with. The future of this country is actually going to be driven by people who figure out that we actually are a diverse country. We actually are a country where that can actually be a strength. And we have to figure out, we can have political differences about issue from issue, but the composition of the country is what it is, and we're going to have to figure out how to move forward. And I think that if I were just John Q. Citizen, and I hope I'm able to do some of this work in my post-administration life, is I'd like to see like an urban community that's got low-performing schools link up with a rural community that's got low-performing schools, and let's figure out how to do something together to raise the standards of our schools. That's not an urban or rural issue. It's happening in both places. Let's figure out how to get there and to break those walls down, because the politics today is a reflection of our country. It's not an aberration.
Do you want to follow up on any of that?
Could I just follow up on one thing, and again, I bolster what Anthony said. One of the things that I have started saying for the past year now, that there's been a real discussion about governance and democracy and what we expect and where we think the country is going, is really and this is very gratifying as a mayor, when people come to complain to me about something, I say to them, well, what did you do? Did you vote? You know, oh, Mayor, the potholes, really? Do you think that the federal government has a role in that? Should the government make sure that, you know, if there's lead paint shipping and you're worried about the children who are impacted by lead paint, well, have you written a letter? Do you know? And it is gratifying as a mayor to be able to do that, because it's sort of, I can do it now as somebody who is not running for re-election because I'm termed out, to say that to them and to also say, like, you have a responsibility too. And if you think that the country should go in a different direction than it has been going, then what have you done to do that? Not participating. The fact that they're talking to me often means that they're participating in their neighborhood group, but also talking to them about participating as members of a democracy.
Let me pick up on that. Just put my old campaign chairman's hat on. Is most of these districts in the House are safe for one party or the other. That's due to a lot of things, residential sorting patterns, gerrymandering, and the like. But that means that the primary is the only race that counts for these folks. And so, as I said, members are catering their interests the other way. And yet, the fastest growing group in the country are independents and decline to states. But for the most part, in some states, they're excluded from voting in primaries. So they get the choices the parties give them, and they're usually out here. In other states, they just don't. We like to say conservatives and liberals have passion, moderates have lives. And the end result is that the passionate tend to govern the process. So when people say, what can I do? I say, get involved in you got to vote in primaries. That's where the action is in most of these cities and towns and everything else.
All right, so I want to circle back to sort of where we started when Congressman Davis pulled out his cell phone and capture some of the thickness of our political discourse as well. There's a lot of talk about the president's ability to communicate directly to his constituents through Twitter, now in 280 characters. There's a lot of conversation about what is true and what is not true in social media. And back to our trust question, how do you know what's true and what's not? So if you were in politics today, what would be your advice about how to use our electronic media tools for good? Anybody want to jump into that to start?
I'll jump in, just because we saw an amazing example around the Boston Marathon. So we had been working with Boston around their own resilience, and the idea of this concept is to enable the government, whether it's local or state or national, to plan more effectively and then rebound more quickly should a crisis hit, because you can't prevent everything, even with good planning. So Boston had been both planning and rehearsing for any kind of crisis across all of their sectors, the private sector, the utilities, transportation, the city government, state government. And they had very clear and interesting plans in place. And it allowed an amazing response after the Boston Marathon bombing, and one that's been written about and thought about extensively. Governor Patrick's role was not to be the FBI or the local police. It was to be the communicator in chief during that period, and that's what they rehearsed in advance. And so if you look at what happened in the 2 days, 3 days until the final perpetrator was caught, he put out every digital wildfire that could have emerged, because rumors after crisis are so rampant, and it reduces the confidence of the general public, either in the police response or in their own safety. And he kept communicating all the time, and he talked about what they knew so far and what they didn't know so far. And if you study that as a case study, it's really quite extraordinary about how an elected official can use, in times of crisis, direct communication with his or her electorate to really solve important problems and to prevent digital rumors. Mm-hmm. So if we can do it in crisis, we want to be able to do it as effectively in times of calm. I think that elected officials ought to communicate more directly with their citizens. I don't resist that President Trump is using Twitter. I resist how he's using Twitter. So, but that's my own personal view. But I do think that horse is out of the barn. And so the more the elected official really learns how to be effective and communicate with his or her constituency, the better control we will have over all of the bad things that can spread on social media. But more importantly, the more connected the individual citizen will feel to the mayor, to the congressman, to whomever, in ways that may get them to engage more and vote more and all the things that we want to see elevated and escalated in our current moment.
Great point.
So as a mayor, I have all of those all of those social media tools, and I have by design had the institution, so if it's the city's website, if it's the city's Twitter, it's just facts that go out on those, just facts. Again, so that it gets, the mindset is, this is the street that's going to be closed, this is the water main break, this is when the parade is going through. And when we have had crises, while we do use that to communicate, we had blue-green algae testing that we had to do in our water source, and we communicated through that every day what the testing was going, what the tests were showing. But you have to have relationships, which means that you have to pick up the phone or go to that neighborhood and have those people see the whites of your eyes so that they know that there's, they trust you, that you're being honest with them, that you're answering their questions. If you're just doing it one way and you're really using it to spin, I think it fundamentally becomes very brittle. And so it's a great tool, but it does not replace relationships and the thickness of the dialogue that is necessary to live in a polyglot society.
Well, I'll pick up. I think it's important they see the whites of your eyes. I still advise members, even in tough, to go out to the town meetings, take the questions, get beat up a little bit. It humanizes you a little bit. If you're halfway decent on your feet and don't get angry, you're going to be okay doing those kind of things. That doesn't solve it, but that's a part of it. And the other thing is again, these districts are not diverse districts. If your primary is your total vote, if that counts, that makes a difference for you. The general election is just, basically irrelevant to your reelection because the primary is the main deal. That's where you spend your time. That's just human nature, and you get one point of view. You watch Fox News or you watch MSNBC, that makes it difficult. I think we don't do enough listening sometimes. When you go out to town meetings, I do a lot of listening. I usually didn't get ahead when I said something, but you just kind of listen, you empathize and feel their pain a little bit and come back and try to synthesize it and put it together.
And look, I think there's a real human dynamic about if somebody sits there and is respectful enough to get yelled at and doesn't get defensive or just takes it, because that's part of your job as an elected official, just take it. Every time that has happened to me, which has happened to me, it's professional, part of the professional job, the person on the other end has vented and they stop and they say, you know what, I respect the fact that you sat here and you listened to it and you took it. And that diffuses situations. It's very natural as human beings to want to vent. What social media has done is it doesn't, you vent, but there's no, there's no end it, and there's no circling it because you can't end it because you don't have that ability to, again, make that human
Also, that
connection.
human connection is always better than electronic connection.
Absolutely.
These districts are so large, you can't do that en masse, but word gets out. I think we don't do enough of that. Now, we've become too reliant on electronic media and social media.
I would say there are many futurists who believe that all of our children will actually feel more comfortable communicating through social media and electronic means than through interpersonal interactions. That is a terrifying but potentially real future that we also need to think about and understand.
That's right.
When you see 2-year-olds, with their iPhone or their iPad, rather than playing with the other 2-year-old in the play yard, That's a future we need to contemplate at least, and then think of more proactive ways to overcome. If interpersonal communication, mano a mano, is really the kind of thing that thickens our discourse.
But just one other thought here, which is that frankly, I use social media. I'm frustrated that I only have 11,000 followers. So if you all could help me with that, it'd be great. But I did a town hall with the Republican chair of the T&I committee, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, Bill Schuster, great friend of mine actually. And it was the first time that had been done quite that way across partisan lines, across the executive branch and the legislative branch. I think to some extent we should be pushing some of our members to do these types of like offbeat things with each other across partisan lines. Maybe they don't solve problems, but at least it starts to cast out there what we were really striving for. Ted Cruz and Cory Booker doing a Twitter town hall would be kind of an interesting thing.
Let's sell tickets to that.
All right, we have time for a couple of audience questions. So please raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. Got one on this side. Bill?
Yeah, hi. Great panel. But one of the things that I think I noticed in your discussion is that you use the broad term federal government. And I think in that reflects the current view in the public that the federal government is this monolithic kind of entity. But as Paul Light has pointed out in his research and other people have pointed out, the real failure of government is a failure of political leadership. And who is that political leadership? It's the Congress and it's the administration in power at the time. But where does the blame go? It goes to the career civil servants. So any thoughts about that?
Look, civil servants are just doing the job Congress told them to do, and they're easy scapegoats at election time to blame it on these nameless, faceless bureaucrats that are doing the jobs we told them to do. So much of it really comes back to the law, oversight on oversight on oversight, people looking over shoulders, just a lot of regulations that didn't need to be written, but Congress mandated they be written, laws passed. But they're just an easy scapegoat. They're also, when there's a political match of some kind, they're the ones that get held hostage, whether it's a government shutdown or whatever. It's a heck of a way to recruit talent, to say, come here, we're going to sequester, and then we're going to shut the government down. Then you don't get a pay raise and no COLA and everything else. And by the way, we're blaming you if something goes wrong. It's the wrong way to run things, and leadership can turn it around. But we're in right now, I would say, the political behavior now, bad behavior gets rewarded. And there's been no pushback on that. But it's a tough way to recruit and to maintain and get good people to come to government. And by the way, if you're nominated and have to go through a hearing at the Senate level, that's not very pleasant either sometimes.
Another question?
Thank you. My question is for Secretary Fox, Mayor Fox. I wouldn't mind being Secretary of Transportation because the first thing I would like to push is for some kind of ultra highway, gigantic highway where passenger cars could do 80, 90 miles an hour and let the trucks and local traffic have the so-called interstates, because I've gone up and down I-95 and I-81 so much. I think it's needed. And I was just wondering, has that ever come up in the Transportation Department? The need to do something like that?
Now you're going to get my 3-hour speech on transportation. The short story is that the Transportation Department's primary responsibility is to ensure the safety of transportation across the country. When it comes to building out new infrastructure, you'd be surprised to find how precious little the federal government actually builds on its own. Usually the sponsor is a state entity, sometimes it's a local entity. And I was talking earlier to Teresa about this. One of our big problems as a country right now when it comes to infrastructure is the colossal amount of unthinking about what that actually means in the 21st century. Part of what I think it means is that we need to be planning around our mega regions, which are economic centers that include cities and suburbs and rural areas. I pushed a rule at USDOT to actually do that. And on a bipartisan basis, Congress passed a law to basically dismantle the rule that we created to do it. But that has to happen, because otherwise we're not going to figure out how to get those movements of both freight and people in these economic centers. The other piece is that we need a national works program. I do believe that the model of the Transcontinental Railroad, the model of the National Highway System, can be replicated. And I don't know, we're not going to speculate what kind of technology we talk about, whether it be a road program or a rail program or a Hyperloop program. But the point is that I think if the federal government's going to try to promote public-private partnerships, it can't do it by remote control, because the states right now kind of are in the driver's seat on most transportation projects. And if we really want to go in that direction, we're going to have a national program.
Absolutely.
Could get one more?
I have a fundamental difference with part of this framework, which is implicitly that there is this basically decent, well-intentioned, well-motivated public that is ill-served by these quarrelsome, selfish, self-seeking legislators. It has been my experience that, and my fellow politicians have made a lot of mistakes, which I've criticized, and the media has been very irresponsible, and the voters are no bargain either, and that they all bring out the worst in each other. And the transportation question raised that with me. Part of the problem you have, and Mayor, I think one of the problems is I started out working for Mayor. As you go, the issues you deal with tend to be ones around which there is more consensus. There is not a pro-garbage in the streets party. There is not a pro don't shovel the snow party. As you get into federal issues, there is that difference. But part of it is the public has, legitimately, this isn't a problem, there are differences, there are unresolved conflicts. And I thought what Secretary should have said was, how am I going to build an ultra highway with current environmental policies? And we have to sort this out. People, I was working for the mayor of Boston, complaining because people in one part of the city wanted a swimming pool built. And the mayor said, okay, and then they were complaining about the noise and the trucks for the swimming pool. I complained to an old city councilor from the north end of Boston, Freddie Langone, and he said, hey kid, ain't you heard the news? Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. And that's part of the problem. There are a lot of unresolved issues on the part of the public. So again, I understand this, but these are not technical problems. They're not solved by thinking outside the box. In many cases, that can help in some cases. But I think you have to, there's just fundamental conflict within the voters themselves about the values, and sorting them out is hard. Now, I agree, it's not being done well right now, but I think implicitly that kind of, this model that, there are all these good people and they're ill-served by these politicians. The question is, I'll just quote Tip O'Neill. At the end, when he would hear these complaints, he would say, point to the House of Representatives and said, nobody in this building parachuted in through the dome. Nobody's here who didn't get more votes than anybody else in the last election from the voters.
Barney, these conflicts exist. In Northern Virginia, which chokes in traffic. We finally got a transportation bill through the legislature, and the chairman of the committee that put through the law loses his primary because he's raising taxes. I mean, you got to have people out there willing to make decisions, willing to make tough decisions, and not just so risk-averse that they want to get reelected. There are no easy trade-offs in this business. And sometimes the leadership's just got to come from us that are in office. I think if you looked at constituents, like you note, they send so many contradictory things. They want free roads, they want free schools, they don't want to have to pay for it, they want their benefits, and it doesn't add up. And that's where leadership comes in. I think our members just get very risk-averse and wanting to get reelected sometimes, and there's nothing wrong with losing if you lose for the right reason.
Let me respectfully push back just a little bit and say that that's fundamental to a democracy. But what I have what I have experienced as a mayor in the past 8 years is that there is a fiction that the ruling party in Congress has put forward, that they are in favor of something, and that they're also in favor of what you want to. And let me give you a hard and fast example of this. I go down to see a member of my delegation early on in my term, and I say, hey, it's old and it's cold in Syracuse, and our water mains are breaking. And we're not going to be able to attract business. We're not going to be able to keep people if you've got rivers running down the streets of Syracuse in February. And said member says to me, yeah, you know, I agree with you. Clean water, really important. Infrastructure, really important. It's just when you talk about revenue, you know, I can't help you there. And I wanted to say, I wanted to say, you know, I'm educating the children. I'm paving the roads. I'm picking up trash. I'm cleaning snow. If you believe that we should have clean water and you believe infrastructure is important, but you turn to me and say, I can't get your revenue, then what are you doing? Because I really, Congressman, don't know that we have lead paint issues in our city. They have drastically reduced lead remediation. Do you think lead paint and children's access to it has a huge deleterious impact on their learning ability?
Well, that's the other problem here. You're all acting as if there's only one political party in America. And I know everybody wants to be bipartisan. Partisan's a bad word. The only time you look and do a word search where partisan comes up nice is fighting the Nazis in Yugoslavia in 19. It was the only good partisans. But in fact, there is a very real difference between the parties. And I understand that, you know, maybe I'll endanger your tax exemption alone. So mad at them for not having a good sign at the entrance, make me walk around. I don't care. It's due here. But the fact is, the two parties are not equal in this regard. And in fact, we'll talk about this later, but at the end of 2007, I would say under George W. Bush, there was genuine bipartisanship on a whole lot of things, on No Child Left Behind, on the response to the 2008 crisis. And then it changed, and I think it's true there's been polarization on both parties, but I think you have a party in power now on the Republican side that doesn't want to resolve these things. Now, not out of meanness, it's a genuine ideological difference. But that's the other problem I have, is ignoring very real partisan differences as you try and figure out how to resolve things. I don't think that can be done.
But I thought the other thing you said in your first set of comments is really important to underline, and that is we're never going to have good government unless we have a good public. So it's not sufficient, but it's a necessary component of what ultimately makes all of this work. And
Lester Maddox said when he said he couldn't do prison reform in Georgia until he got a better bed.
And on that note, we are out of time, so thank you very much.
Really enjoyed that.
well, we were the liveliest. We're definitely the liveliest.
Yeah, the question is, do we need a better class of prisoners, a better class of citizens? I think one thing for sure that we learned is we need leaders. And the people that just participated in this panel are leaders. And I appreciate very much each of their comments and the time that they've given us. It was insightful and helpful and continued our discussion.